I'd like to thank the BioLab for having me back. It's nice to be here, and nice to see how inspired they've been with the theme of art and science. And definitely check out the exhibit if you haven't had time to do that. The stories that I'm going to share with you today, most of them are in the book, although not in this arrangement. But they're modern stories of science that originated on the European continent 500 years ago. The Enlightenment created a search for order, knowledge through empirical observation. Romanticism emphasized the self, one's feelings and emotions, and attempted to discover spirituality in nature. But I want to acknowledge that for thousands of years before European contact with North America, the Wabanaki people had their own ecological understanding of this place and ways of expressing that understanding. And Kemetic, what they call this place, was and still is very important to their understanding. These are the petroglyphs and the chimes. In 1604, Samuel de Champlain landed on the island that he named Mount Desert. He produced a map from his expedition in 1606 and 1607 and delivered it to Sir Dumont. Because of his curiosity and his very honest portrayal of Acadia, in words and in his cartography, Champlain could be considered the first scientist to visit the island as well as one of the first artists. His map-making employed the latest mathematical compass declinations. Unlike other explorers, Champlain did not depict the continent as uninhabited wilderness, but he acknowledged that there was civilization already established here, and he drew Wabanaki villages and encampments. Other explorers brought illustrators along on their voyages so they could accurately show the true wonders that were being discovered. All of these people were coming over, looking new plants and weird, crazy animals, and sending reports back to Europe of strange things they had seen, and so they needed artists to depict these plants and animals. Champlain came here at a time when the roots of science as we know it today were really just emerging. So disciplined inquiry, systematic observation, a love of study, a belief that the knowledge that Champlain was documenting would be immediately useful to people back home. Drawings of direct observations are the simplest and oldest form of scientific illustration. Images described phenomena and manuscripts were copied by hand. Maps and charts were some of the first art and science collaborations in Acadia. During the period of exploration and colonization, mariners relied on privately printed charts. Most were based on British work that itself was translations from French and Spanish and Portuguese in the 16th century. One of those translators was Richard Eden of England, for whom the town of Eden was named, later renamed Bar Harbor. Like Champlain, Eden wanted to show more than just past accomplishments, but he wanted to show that ocean exploration was producing results and produce a guide that would be useful to people who were exploring the land, the sea, and the stars. So this art of navigation, his translation, was printed in Spain in 1556. It featured woodcuts, which evolved into engravings in the 15th century. The first truly American navigational atlases came from Edmund Blunt of Newburyport, Massachusetts. Blunt had been a journalist, but he was shocked by how bad most of the existing navigational guides were. They were full of inaccuracies, and that resulted in direct harm to people. And so he retired from the newspaper business to publish the American Coast Pilot, which was only text at first, and it contained remnants of Eden's guide from centuries before. The most popular navigational text in the late 18th century was the New Practical Navigator, which was published in Britain in 1772. And so Blunt published an American, he published his own version. And by 1802, he was already on the third edition of that. And he really wanted to improve upon the British version, which was a bestseller. And he felt a responsibility to the young nation of America. And so he asked Nathaniel Bowditch, a well-known mathematician and skilled navigator, to revise the manual and correct the numerous errors throughout. The result was the New American Practical Navigator, which was a guide that could be read and understood by all sailors. Bowditch had already been revising and making his own guides and charts and things, and so he was the right person to do it. And it was actually published continuously for the next 150 years. And an Acadia footnote, so Bowditch's fame, he was so well known and famous among seamen, that Isle Ho residents actually put out the welcome mat to his descendant, landscape architect Ernest Bowditch, when he founded the Point Lookout Summer Colony on Isle Ho in the 1880s. So famous relatives can help you out. In 1837, so we're starting to see some more charts drawn by Americans of the region. This is Captain Seward Porter's charts from 1837 of the coast of Maine. He showed the islands, he detailed shoreline features, and these were produced by Thomas Moore's lithography shop in Boston. His charts showed the depth of Soane Sound around the Cranberry Isles. He showed the rocks and the ledges of Isle Ho. Lithography uses oil on stone to print, so the ink sticks to the oil. It was invented in Germany in 1797. Moore's lithography shop did not operate for very long, 10 or 15 years, but it reproduced most of the first depictions of Acadia, including a modified version of Thomas Doughty's 1836 painting, Desert Rock Lighthouse. The advances in printing technology, combined with the taste for this kind of imagery and its scientific explanations, increased the number of images in circulation. This image was also printed by Thomas Moore. Fairly similar, yet it was based on a scientific rather than an artistic expedition. It's a plate from an atlas of illustrations by Francis Grader, who accompanied the first geological survey of Maine in 1836. Grader was born in Germany. He moved to America in 1826. He worked as an illustrator and an art instructor. He believed in drawing from nature. His students included Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The survey was led by Charles Jackson and ordered by the state legislature. After Maine became a state in 1820, there was a lot of work that had to be done to know what kind of resources lay within the borders of the new state. Jackson was trained as a physician, as many scientists were in this time, because it wasn't really a thing to be a scientist yet, but he much preferred studying chemistry and geology. He was a somewhat kind of controversial figure who was well known as one of the leading scientific men in the country. His overwhelming concern in the survey, he was looking for resources that could be exploited. So he was looking for minerals, he was looking for good agricultural soils, he was looking for good timber. He only visited Mount Desert just briefly in the first year. The atlas, only a few copies of the atlas were printed, and the legislature decided that it cost too much money to have a draftsman with the survey team, and so Francis Grader was let go from the survey after the first year. The same time as Jackson's survey and navigational charting work, landscape painting was developing in the art world. Thomas Cole studied geology. He illustrated the findings of geologists to support the religious and moral themes in his paintings. Science and art were used together for religious purposes. God's truth writ large across the earth's surface. Cole's student, Frederick Church, strived to portray the rocks accurately, to capture the fading light of sunset, ocean spray, filtered light. His involvement in science was even greater than Cole's. The texture, the grain, the hardness, the color, all had to be accurate, and Maine really helped Church reach a new level in his art. Cultivating an appreciation for landscape was like, that's what the exclusive few did. Knowledge of fine art and science was very useful in social situations, such as this one. Just as people in Boston and Philadelphia and New York should be able to maintain a conversation about the picturesque, they also should be able to discuss scientific topics. So the components of the picture, the makeup of the rocks, the species of tree, the sinuous shape of a river oxbow. To be among the exclusive urban residents, devoured published travel stories, they attended scientific lectures, viewed art exhibits. When they finally visited Acadia themselves, they looked for the scenes that famous artists had selected and approved for them. Meanwhile, out on the ocean, errors persisted in existing navigational maps and guides. Shipwrecks like the one shown in Thomas Doughty's lighthouse image were common and very costly for insurance companies. In response, President Thomas Jefferson created the Survey of the Coast in 1807 to provide nautical charts for America's growing ports and busy coastline. Before they could position vessels at sea to measure the depths and map hazards like rocks and reefs, federal surveyors had to establish known positions on land that they could tie the water depths to. They also wanted to create a standardized system of mapping and charting. So beginning in New York, reconnaissance teams spread north and south along the East Coast to search for locations that could be used as common reference points. By 1850, they had worked their way north to Acadia, scoping out potential locations to serve as benchmarks on Mount Desert and Isle Hill. Artists, draftsmen, illustrators, engravers were employed by the Coast Survey. Some of them include James McNeill Whistler, briefly, John Ross Key, Gilbert Munger. Here is an image of a survey party near Cherryfield in 1857. Coast Survey assistant Edwin Hergesheimer used Acadia and Norumbega Mountain, Eagle Cliff, and Echo Mountain to illustrate eroded and fractured granite. His drawings were created with accompanying plan view topographical maps as an aid to standardize map symbols used by the survey and also to show how to interpret contours. A topographer would place a blank sheet of paper on a plane table and draw, and then those field drawings would be given to engravers for reproduction on copper plates. Engravings were used to show physical principles, diagrams, and methods of science. The completed topography of the island was published in 1875. What's interesting about a whole chapter, I go through all the maps in the book, and what's really interesting about the Coast Survey topographical map is that the island is tipped, right? So that the mountains are all sort of in a line, and it's the only one that does that. So when you see future maps that were derived, you'll know if they were derived from this one, if the island has that tilt to it. And then finally, the topographic data were combined with hydrographic data in a navigational chart in 1883. Scientific illustrators also provided comic relief. Alexander Longfellow, who was brother to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, worked for the survey for close to 40 years. This is a cartoon that he drew of Coast Survey working on Richmond's Island. Another state legislated geological survey took place in 1861 and 1862. It was led by Charles Hitchcock and Ezekiel Holmes. They expanded Charles Jackson's work documenting the geology of the state, and they created the first statewide map of bedrock geology. Marine biology was also advancing by the second half of the 19th century. In 1858, the New York Tribune published an account of a cruise from Boston to Mount Desert by a writer named Robert Carter. They sailed aboard a cod fishing schooner. Again, there weren't tourist boats, and sailing for pleasure wasn't really popular yet, so they used a sort of modified fishing boat named Helen of Swampscott. And it was Carter, it was Smithsonian ichthyology professor, he was called in the book, and expert crab catcher William Stimpson. They surveyed marine organisms along the trip, and then also aboard were Francis Underwood of the Atlantic Monthly and naturalist Robert Kennicott, whom Carter dubbed the artist in the book version of his articles. In addition to talking about the crabs and the marine organisms that they found along the way and some travel tips, he also acknowledged the artists who had come before him. Carter wrote, "It is difficult to conceive of any finer combination of land and water than this view, which has been admirably painted by Charles Dix." Dix was among the artists who followed Cole and Church and Lane, a distinguished group that also included John Kensett, Regis Giroux, Albert Bierstadt, and William Stanley Hasseltine. Hasseltine was motivated by science. His rock portraits displayed a fidelity to nature. Idaho and Schoodic also received the attention of artists, but much less so than Mount Desert, especially in the 19th century. Geology continued to advance. One of the things that you'll note is in looking at both the visual imagery and the text from science through time, they're not only tracing the history of science and art in Acadia, but they're really reflecting the larger history of science during this time and the larger history of art during this time. So Louis Agassiz came to Maine and traveled to Mount Desert in September 1864. He came with a local Maine geologist named John Delasky. By this time, Agassiz was already directing the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and the Ice Age theory that he helped develop was generally accepted. The image that you see on the screen on the left is from his 1840 study of the glaciers, which featured these stunning, I encourage you to look them up because they're really beautiful lithographed illustrations by Joseph Bettier. So Mount Desert, when he came here, the theory was pretty well accepted, but it gave Agassiz clear evidence for his idea. He crossed the bridge from Trenton. He noticed the same grooves and scratches that he knew from studying glaciers in the Alps. And he had a two-part article in the Atlantic Monthly. It was highly readable, but did not have any illustrations. Nathaniel Southgate Shaler was a student of Agassiz. He worked with Charles Jackson, that original Maine geological surveyor, as an undergraduate at Harvard. He first came to Mount Desert when he was an undergraduate in 1860 with fellow students Addison Emery Verrill and Alpheus Hyatt. They came to dredge for invertebrates in the bay, like the summer science expedition was a popular activity among the educated. They camped at the base of Cadillac Mountain. Shaler went on to become a professor at Harvard of paleontology and geology. He continued to visit the Maine coast. He conducted what could be considered the first systematic study of the geology of Mount Desert. He published a report about sea level changes in 1874 and the geology of Mount Desert in 1889. These were with the U.S. Geological Survey. Illustrations were by Delancey Gill. Gill later went out west and took up photography and became really well known for photographs of Native Americans in the West. But he originally took up photography because there was no one else around to do it. And the 1889 report by Shaler also had wood engravings by Max Wildauer of New York. Florence Bascom also described the island for the U.S. Geological Survey in the early 20th century. She was the first woman to receive a PhD from Johns Hopkins. She was the second woman to receive a PhD in geology. She was the first woman to work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and she conducted a lot of field work for the USGS, including a visit to Maine during summer breaks from teaching at Bryn Mawr College. Her report is illustrated with photographs by William C. Alden. The photos are from 1909. I don't know yet, I'm still researching this, if Bascom was on the island at the same time as Alden or if she came later and just used his photographs, but Alden was also a geologist. Photography was invented in 1839, but not widely used until later in the 19th century. But for scientists, photographs really allowed nature to just illustrate itself. Just a couple more of Alden's photographs.
What year?
1909.
Where are they? Location of the previous one?
You tell me.
That's on a freebie.
That one. Good. How about that one?
Yeah.
Maureen.
Acadia.
In 1880, Charles Eliot, he was son of Harvard President Charles William Eliot. He led a group of his fellow Harvard undergraduates on a summer camping trip to the island. He'd been coming to Mount Desert since 1871 when his father brought him and his brother Samuel to camp on Calf Island. With memories of those times sharp in his mind, he gathered 13 of his friends together to plan their summer. His father let him use the camping equipment and the sailboat, and in exchange, the young men had to agree to do some work in some branch of natural history or science. They returned every summer with various membership. Their ranks included a poet, John McGow Foster, and a photographer, Marshall P. Slade. Marshall Slade's photos decorate the logbooks, which are in the collection of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. And if you're not doing anything on Thursday, I encourage you to visit the Society's Soamesville Museum, where they're opening an exhibit that's all about the Champlain Society. And it's going to feature their logbooks and a lot of photographs and more information. So I encourage you to check that out. Edward Rand was a member of the Champlain Society. He served as their secretary and chair of the botanical department. In later years, his younger brother Henry also joined the Champlain Society. Henry helped with botanical collecting and path making, and he later became a photographer. Edward eventually published the Champlain Society's botanical work as the Flora of Mount Desert, documenting nearly 1,500 plant species. That book includes a report of the Champlain Society's Geological Department by William Lawrence Davis. Botanical science also required drawings. Charles Faxon drew for Silva of North America. Elsie Shaw and Marion Satterley were locals who illustrated How to Know the Wildflowers, which was written by Theodora Parsons, originally published as Mrs. William Starr Dana. Mrs. William Starr Dana took up botany the summer after her husband died. She came to Bar Harbor and spent the summer with Marion Satterley and decided that a book was needed. Everybody was collecting flowers and plants and they really needed a field guide. And so she took that on. Kate Furbish illustrated Flora of Maine. Margaret Stefka, who was the wife of Acadia's first naturalist Arthur Stefka, detailed flowering plants and trees in the park's monthly newsletter, Nature Notes. Botanical illustration matured around the year 1400. Plants were of great interest to natural ancient philosophers. Verbal description after, these were early 1900s, but into the 20th century, verbal description kind of supplanted. This was like viewed as kind of quaint, and verbal description was really what scientists expected. But really, wildflower illustrations never went out of style, and in fact, I was in my office this morning, and I got in the mail from my publisher, Rowman & Littlefield, a nice little advertising booklet where Bowdoin College is publishing a new version of the Flora of Maine with Kate Furbish's illustrations. So that was like a great book. So they never go out of style. Like many other students of his time and place, Champlain Society Captain Charles Eliot practiced sketching. So his mother, who died when he was very young, loved to draw and appreciated art. This is a sketch that the young Charles Eliot made of their camp on Calf Island, so in the 1870s. You can see it's the same tents that the Champlain Society had, but a different viewpoint. After graduating from Harvard, Charles decided to enter the field of landscape architecture, which was fairly new at the time. He apprenticed with Frederick Law Olmsted. He toured the gardens of Europe. He came back to Boston and opened his own landscape architecture firm. He wrote many articles about landscape and conservation. He thought of himself as an artist working with nature as his medium. Charles Eliot compared preservation of nature to the creation of art museums. This is Eliot. Generous men and women would be ready to buy and give into a land trust association that he was proposing some of these fine and strongly characterized works of nature, just as others buy and give to a museum fine works of art. Lovely natural scenery supplies an education in the love of beauty and a means of human enjoyment at least as valuable as that afforded by pictures. And if, as we are taught, feeling for artistic beauty has its roots in feeling for natural beauty, opportunities for beholding natural beauty will certainly be needed and prized by successive generations. Eliot wrote that in 1890. The following year, he would go on to create the Trustees of Public Reservations in Massachusetts, which created the model that, after Charles Eliot's untimely death, his father would use to form the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations with George Dorr here in Bar Harbor. The scientific texts, the geological reports, the field notebooks of the 19th century contain language very understandable to a non-scientist. As a science writer, I appreciate these texts. Many reference and quote poetry. The language of landscape art and the picturesque can be found throughout. Some have portrayed this art, landscape, tourism story of Acadia as somewhat superficial, a cult of scenery. But I think there's another way to look at the trend. The English language does not have appropriate words for relating to nature. If you look to other cultures, they have other concepts and words to describe experiencing nature. But we don't have those words in the English language. For a long time, science and nature were tangled up with ideas of religion and conquest. But the concept of the picturesque, what the landscape painters of the 19th century brought, gave people a new and acceptable way to experience nature and a language to describe it. So it wasn't just okay to love nature, but it was expected. Here on Mount Desert Island, both scientists and artists turned that love into conservation, giving us the place called Acadia. Many people helped with this and other stories that are in the book. All of their names are up there. I am not an art scholar. I am not a trained historian, so I welcome your comments and I welcome your questions and discussion, and appreciate you coming out tonight. Luckily it's solstice, so you still have a couple hours of daylight. Thank you.
Is Calf Island still called Calf Island?
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm hoping you could say more about the association of Eden to the name Eden of Bar Harbor. I always thought it was about the place. But tell me, do you know, how did you find that out?
I knew somebody was going to ask me that. I should have looked it up before I came here. So I can look it up afterwards on my computer. It's in multiple references that Bar Harbor was named for Eden. So older recipe. It might be in street. It's in a couple other additional places. It wasn't just one reference. But yeah, Richard, he was really well known as this translator and producer of documents. So whoever came here and named the town from Europe obviously sort of had a connection or wanted to show some fidelity. So, yes.
Yeah, you mentioned about native plants and the drawings as a guide, but I was wondering from a science and medical point of view, has anybody written any early ethnobotany of plants and how natives use them to cure different diseases?
Yep, so there are some ethnographic studies that the Wabanaki tribes in Maine have funded in partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency. So the Acadia National Park had an ethnographic study, the Wabanaki peoples, was 2 volumes, and so they talk about the plants that were used.
And that's today or goes back to 1880s?
It goes back well before 1880s. It goes back centuries to pre-European contact. And we also have other references, so Fanny Hardy Extorms, her writing about how the natives use plants, so there's other documents that are a little more contemporary.
What inspired you to write the historical Acadia?
A call from a publisher. I had been working on an Acadia sort of book project for about 5 years anyway, and then was still kind of working on it. It wasn't quite coming together as a book, but when I did, I had just finished my book that came out last summer, The President's Salmon, and that editor knew another editor who was putting together a series of books on the national park. So my new book, Historic Acadia National Park, is one of the series. There's a few other ones. So there's Redwood and Glacier and Yosemite and I think Everglades. So he was doing the series, so he asked if I wanted to do the book. But the bigger answer, I think, is just, Acadia. I think being in this place, you just want to know more about its history. And there's so many good stories, and there's still so many, amazingly, that haven't been told. So there's just a lot of material. Does that help? Yeah.
You mentioned that Louis Agassiz had been here and was interested in the glaciers, but he was also someone who studied peoples and was very interested in sort of racial difference. And I wonder, in your research, have you come across across any engagement that Agassiz may have had with the Wabanaki?
No, I don't think he had, any. He came with John Delasky, so he doesn't mention Delasky in his article. He takes credit for everything. But Delasky actually is now gaining credit, who actually had his own ideas about the Ice Age and well before, kind of at the same time as and before Agassiz. So Agassiz, Delasky took him here to show him the glaciers. And in 1864 in Harvard, Agassiz was he was anti-Darwin, right? He didn't agree with Darwin. He was kind of he was fading from his former glory. And I think when he came here and wrote that article in the Atlantic Monthly, he was trying to get back to the good old days when he was a big famous scientist. So I don't think he would have kind of gone there, Just my opinion.
A comment, which is the integration that you've heard from Catherine today is embodied wonderfully in her book on Acadia, and it is the first book of our time that really integrates and draws on a lot of good historiography done by several folks, but Catherine is the one who has seen it clearly as a whole, and even under intense circumstances, produced a text to make it sing. And so if you're looking for the modern history of Acadia that will stand for a while, pick it up.
Excellent.